and then we'll start. Cool. Hello, everybody. Going to give everybody a second to get into the Zoom, and then we'll begin our event tonight. Very exciting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Oliver from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with William Neuman, presenting his new book, Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse, Inside the Collapse of Venezuela. He will be talking with Robert Kolker, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to William, Robert, and the team at St. Martin's Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot hear or see you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. at both of our Fulton Street and Flatbush Avenue stores, where you can purchase William's book and many others on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the U.S. I'll drop the buy link in the chat when I'm done with the introduction. As thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we are offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon code Greenlight Events 10 in the coupon discount section at the checkout online for 10% off. And lastly, William is stopping by our store to sign copies of the book, so you can get a signed book by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request and order comments at checkout while ordering online, or look for signed copies when you visit the store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Robert Kolker. Kolker is the author of Hidden Valley Road, an instant #1 New York Times bestseller and selection of Oprah's book club that was named a top 10 book of 2020 by numerous publications. He is a National Magazine Award finalist whose journalism has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Marshall Project, Bloomberg Business Week, and New York magazines. He will be speaking with our featured author, William Neuman, as author and journalist who reported for the New York Times for over 15 years. He served as the Times Anne's region bureau chief from 2012 to 2016, while based in Caracas, Venezuela. He previously reported for the New York Post. His work has also been featured in Details, The Independent, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, among others. He began his journalism career while living in Mexico and has published English translations of several Spanish-language novels. Neuman's new book, Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse, is a nuanced and deeply reported account of the collapse of Venezuela and what it could mean for the rest of the world. William is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Robert and with all of you. Please take it away, William and Robert.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you. I want to say thank you at the start to Greenlight for hosting this event, and thank you very, very much to Bob for being here to moderate. He has an amazing book called Hidden Valley Road that I read while I was working on my book, and it was very inspiring. And anyway, I highly recommend it. So I'm going to read from a short passage from the book. I lived in Caracas from 2012 to 2016, and then I went back frequently after that. And a big portion of the book was written in 2019 when Venezuela was in the news a lot, and Juan Guaido declared himself interim president, and the US was threatening to invade. And also there were massive blackouts all across the country the entire country went dark multiple times during that year because the whole infrastructure system was decaying. And so I happened to be there during that period of time, and the blackouts become a running theme through the book that I return to a lot. And so this passage takes place in the city of Maracaibo, which is the second largest city in the country, about 1.5 million people. When I was there, the whole city seemed to be falling apart. People didn't have water. They didn't have cooking gas. They often didn't have electricity. And often there were more cars that seemed to be online trying to buy gasoline, which was in short supply, than actually on the road. This takes place during a localized blackout. So here goes. Night falls. Santa Teresita is a small middle-class neighborhood in Maracaibo, just off the main road to the airport. Little more than a cul-de-sac, one long curving dead-end street with a couple of other dead-end streets branching off it. Tonight, the residents have thrown tree branches across the airport road to keep traffic from going through. For them, it's another night without electricity, and they're fed up. Everyone out to protest, block the street, build a barricade. No one goes through until we get electricity. Their location is strategic. But the strategy has a flaw. Since there are almost no flights coming in or going out, and none at night, there isn't much traffic to block. The crisis frustrates people's ability to protest it. What does it mean to block a road that has no traffic? It was May 2019. Power went out here in this neighborhood, this circuit of the larger grid 3 days ago. After a day and a half, it came back on briefly and then went out again. That was yesterday at midday, and the lights haven't come back on since. Within the general uncertainty of blackouts and power rationing, the residents of Santa Teresita feel as though they've been singled out. Feel as though they've been singled out for an additional portion, one humiliation too many. When I arrived there that night at about 8 p.m., about 40 people were at the roadblock. Every once in a while, a car pulled up. The driver would lean out the window and argue with the protesters. After a while, the car would turn around and drive away. The residents of Santa Teresita were angry and afraid. They were afraid of the police, and they were more afraid that the police would send the colectivos, the armed motorcycle gangs that served as the government's shock troops. They were afraid that the colectivos would come and that there would be violence. People crowded around me. They saw that I was an American, a journalist. "When are the Marines going to come and overthrow Maduro?" someone said, a voice in the darkness. "You tell Trump we're waiting for him," said another. "Invasions come with casualties," I said. "They don't always go as planned." "People are dying anyway," a man said. "That's right." A woman jumped into the conversation, and they talked over one another. "People are dying from hunger, being shot in protests, dying for want of medical care." "Those are deaths," the man said, "that nobody sees." A woman said, "We don't have money, we don't have water, we don't have electricity." It was too dark for me to write in my notebook, so I used a recorder. It preserved a jumble of desperate, overlapping voices. The only light came from the floodlights powered by a generator in the parking lot of a hotel on the airport road. It was called Hotel Aeropuerto. The parking lot was empty, a black rectangle under a black sky. No flights, no guests. I spoke with a man named Alejandro Delgado. He was a criminal lawyer. Between cases, he drove a taxi. "You feel powerless," he said. He was talking about the disruptions to their lives, the arbitrariness of electricity's coming and going, of the uncertain water supply. It robbed you of your sleep. That was the worst. Normally, you slept with the air conditioner on, but without power, in the heat of Maracaibo, you had to leave the windows open or sleep outside, and the mosquitoes wouldn't leave you alone. You could wrap yourself up in a sheet, but then you felt like you were suffocating, and still you couldn't sleep. On top of all that, you were on edge all the time. You were worried about your family, your neighbors, and you were always ready to wake up in the middle of the night if the lights came on or the water came on. If you finally fell asleep, it was like you were sleeping with one eye open. "This is not a life with dignity," Alejandro said. A man listening to us broke in. "We're the walking dead here." "They're killing us slowly," Alejandro said. "We're like zombies," said a shivering woman with thin, bare arms. Her words came out in angry, repetitive bursts. "They're killing us. No food, no electricity. We're going to disappear any day now. Look, sometimes you get up and your stomach is flat against your spine." Maybe you could afford to buy some rice, but nothing to go with it. Or maybe some corn flour, but then you make arepas and there's nothing to put in them. "They're starving us to death," she said. "So what does that make us? Zombies, zombies, zombies. Here, here, here. No one is obese here. We're all skinny. We're all skinny, skinny." Alejandro said, "You get up from the table and you're already thinking about tomorrow. What am I going to eat tomorrow? The agitated woman who talked about zombies was named Shimara Jaime. You're having your arepa for breakfast, she said, and you're already thinking, what am I going to make for lunch? You've got rice because you bought some. Okay, and what about meat or chicken, salad, soup? Chicken, salad, cheese, Alejandro said. They were like old people, remembering the names of vanished, outdated products that they hadn't seen since childhood. Nothing. Shimada said that she'd always been with the opposition, always against Chavez and now against Maduro. Alejandro had a soft, thoughtful voice, and he spoke slowly. I don't consider myself on one side or the other, he said. I applaud the good things and criticize the bad things. So,
thank you, Willie. That was a wonderful passage. It kind of gets at it's representative, I believe, of so much of the tone of your book, which is both entertaining and worthy of outrage, and also humane, and also captures sort of the subtlety of a situation at the same time that it draws you in. I must congratulate you. It's a terrific book. I'll just say to the audience that well, Willie and I are more or less of the same vintage in terms of media people in New York, and we have some friends in common, but we don't know each other too well. I think that in my years working as a journalist in New York, I would often look at nonfiction books and I would wonder what's a good one and what's a bad one and how do you do it right? And I came to believe that some of the best nonfiction really lifts the veil on something you never really understood before, something you never really, that perhaps was intimidating to you, that you never really knew you would ever understand. But because it's foreign, but because the story is told in a human and accessible way and draws you in, great nonfiction really can make a difference in your life. And I think that's what we have here with Willie's book. And that's what I appreciated so much about it. I say this kind of as a caveat to the audience because I'm not a Venezuela expert. I come to this as a general reader and as a layperson with terrible Spanish pronunciation. So I apologize in the hour to come if I mangle something. And of course, my understanding of Venezuela was as an American layperson. If you had asked me months ago what about Venezuela, I would have said something about Sidney Powell and voting machines. And of course, I would have said something about oil. And I'd be vaguely aware that this is a country that has a lot of resources like oil, but also is deeply, deeply troubled, is collapsing. And I would wonder why. And I've always kind of wondered why. And here's a book that explains it beautifully. But before we get into the policy, I'll say one more thing before we start with a back and forth. I want to, the prose in this book really draws you in. I would imagine that if I had to report and write a book about Venezuela or any foreign country, there would be a temptation to overly romanticize a foreign country. And I imagine another pitfall would be to paint that country as entirely some sort of dystopia. And I imagine that those pitfalls were probably sitting there when writing about Venezuela, which is a country in such crisis, but also with such beauty. But Willie really avoids these pitfalls quite wisely. And yet he has an artful way of capturing what's both seductive and troubling about Venezuela. There's lots of suffering, but also lots of outrageous, cynical leadership that really upsets you as you read it. And then there's also farcical moments like the demonstrators trying to block traffic and no traffic turning up. And I'll get to more questions about the nitty gritty, but I thought I'd start by asking you, Willie, how, you were a journalist for a long time before you became the bureau chief and started covering Venezuela. And I thought I'd ask how that came about and what surprised you about the place as you got to know it.
Well, first off, thank you, Bob. That was well, anyway, thanks very much for your words. I don't know what to say, I guess. But at any rate, well, I started out as a reporter. I learned to be a reporter in Mexico City a long time ago. That was the first article I ever wrote in my life was in Mexico City. I was down there translating novels, mystery novels, as a matter of fact, from Spanish to English. And I never had any interest in being a journalist. And I had a friend who was, and I needed money. And so she sort of got me my first job, and that's how it started. And so I always had a connection to Latin America and Mexico. And then many years later, I just was fortunate enough that the job came open in Venezuela for the Times. I was at the Times, and they asked me if I was interested, and I was. So I went down there as the Andes correspondent. So I covered Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, mostly, but also some of the other countries down there. And when I first got down there, I had never, it was the first time when I first went to Venezuela, it was the first time I'd been to South America. So I really went down very intentionally wanting to not go with preconceived notions, but wanting to see for myself what things were, especially in Venezuela, where, so much had been written about Chavez, and, it would be easy to go down there and sort of just think, oh, well, Chavismo, everything I'd read before. And I just wanted to not buy into other people's biases or experiences, but experience it for myself, and really spent a lot of time with both sides of the divide there, which is pro-Chavez, anti-Chavez at that time, and just be out in the street as much as possible, talking to as many people as possible. So that's how that.
Wonderful. And I do think that it comes out in this book, the way that you're able to move from specific scenes and visits with people to the general. And I thought I would ask you a little bit about some of the people who populate this book, but because I think I don't want to leave the audience with the impression that this is a policy book only, and that it's an academic book only. That there are humans populating it who really are going through very extreme and fascinating dramas, each of their own, and yet each of their dramas are linked to vital issues that the country is facing. So maybe I thought we'd start with the lightning round, where you can introduce readers to some of the people you meet in the book. And I'll start with Hilda, who populates the barrio in living in really very trying circumstances.
Well, I very much wanted to find a way to tell the story of the country through the people. And as I went around talking to people, I discovered that, people's lives tend to follow the contours of the country they live in. And in Venezuela, which has been such a volatile place over the last 20, 30 years, I just discovered that the highs and lows of people's lives sort of corresponded to highs and lows in the country. So Hilda is somebody who, she's in her 30s. She lives in a barrio called Petare, which a lot of people call the biggest slum in Latin America. She lives on a hillside because all of Petare is on a hillside. And so the whole thing is a bunch of narrow stairways zigzagging up the hill. It's intensely violent. She lives in a part of it called Jose Felix, which is the most violent part of one of the most violent places on the continent. And there's a tremendous amount of gang violence. There's a gang leader who sort of runs the place. And she has she had 8 children. One of them died, so now she has 7. And she lives with her husband and her kids in a tin shack. And they had lived in a cinder block house previously, but when one of their children died, was murdered due to the circumstances, the funeral costs, the costs of sort of searching for the missing child, they basically ran out of money, lost their home, and had to move into this shack. And at the same time, she's just a wonderful person. I mean, I'm still in touch with her. We text each other frequently. She's has a tremendous amount of ingenuity, and she just works so hard and loves her kids so much. And so I just found her to be a tremendously inspiring person, and her story just really tells the story of what it's like to live in these extremely poor places in Venezuela.
She starts like 2 or 3 businesses, right? In the book,
she starts a baking business. She does people's nails. When I was down in Caracas last time, she was which was just a few months ago. She was repairing refrigerators. She's like, in any other country, she'd be an entrepreneur. But frequently in that house, there's nothing to eat. It's horrible. It's distressing, all these kids. And I mean, when I first met her, her youngest kid's teeth were falling out because of lack of calcium.
Wow. And you move from different parts of the country, and you see people in different circumstances, and you see just what how drastic the differences can be. There are people who are closer to Caracas who don't have some of these same problems. It's really quite stark to see that.
Yeah, well, Caracas tends to, although Hilda lives in Caracas, but Caracas tends to have more services than the rest of the country. They try to keep it going. But places like Maracaibo, which is the setting of the passage that I read when I was there, it literally was emptying out. By some estimates, a third of the people had left. It's close to the border with Colombia, so it was easy for people to leave. And you really got that feeling in moving around Maracaibo that it was an empty city. There's a famous Venezuelan novel called Dead Houses, which describes a town that had once been a boom town, and then because of disease and other things, everybody had moved away and was full of what the author called dead houses. And Maracaibo is definitely like that. One of the people in Maracaibo whose story I tell is a woman named Margelis, who was a manager in a hotel. And she's another person who she just, full of insight, just a wonderful person, an amazing story. She grew up very poor and always wanted to move to this, she grew up poor in a rural area, always wanted to move to the city, got an education, went to college, moved to the city. Everything she did, she sort of advanced quickly and became a manager. And so she ended up being one of the managers in this hotel, which was a hotel, that it was a middle-class hotel, but it was very popular. A lot of people would go there to do weddings and that sort of thing. And during the blackouts, there was a lot of looting. And so they would these groups would go through the town, and they'd first hit a shopping mall or hit another place. And one of the last places they went to was this hotel, and they just stripped it out. It's amazing. It's like, when I was there, it just felt like somebody had turned it out, ripped all the wiring, everything out, and then just left it there as this shell. And so Margelis tells the story of what that was like. And, she also, in the course of that, I tell her life story and how during the boom times in Venezuela, her life got much better. She lived very well, and then the bottom fell out. And that's just a very typical story there, but it's told through her eyes, essentially, in her life.
The story of the bottom falling out is fascinating, because you really left me, at least, with the impression that there was a lot of smoke and mirrors going on even during the good times, and a lot of huge mistakes during the good times. And so when things get bad, it actually it's the chickens coming home to roost after years and years of neglect. But not everybody perhaps sees it that way.
Well, the mistakes are what led to the bad times. I mean, the problem. The essential problem with Venezuela is that, it's an oil country, and oil is sort of is the motor of the economy. And so Chavez was very fortunate. People talk about Chavez having charisma. What Chavez had was oil at $100 a barrel. So when he becomes president, he gets elected in 1998 as an outsider candidate, as a disruptor candidate. All the political parties are corrupt, all the politicians are corrupt, and he comes out of nowhere, and nobody thinks he's got a chance to win, and he does, which might sound familiar to some people here in this country. And and this occurs after essentially 2 decades of economic stagnation and recession and turbulence, so when he gets elected and gets sworn in, oil is at $8 a barrel, which was, very extremely low historically. And then it goes up to over $100 a barrel, $120 a barrel at one point. And in other words, the country just filled up with money. And that's a good thing. If your country fills up with money and you could do lots with it. The problem is they basically spent the money, wasted it, or stole it. Billions and billions of dollars were stolen. Billions were spent on projects that were never finished, hospitals, bridges, all sorts of things. You drive around the country and you just see all these railways that are just sitting there half built. And some of the money went into half building them, and whatever didn't go into that was stolen, disappeared. And then other things were they wasted money. They created programs that were poorly run and didn't help very many people, but helped a few, that sort of thing. And they literally saved nothing. When Chavez comes into office, there was a law that said that they had to sort of have a rainy day fund, and he got the law changed and got rid of the laws. So when by the end of his time in office, there was $3 million in that fund, which is nothing. And then he dies and the price of oil drops, and so the country essentially runs out of money.
This to me is a very telling thing you say about the Chavez years, is that he kind of, in some ways, it's more of the same, that there isn't a big difference, except that the economy is booming, and so he can hand out a lot of money. But also he is picking apart the institutions of the country. He is controlling the Supreme Court, and he's getting rid of the rainy day fund. Anything that might have created some stability for the country goes away and so he is the only thing that matters. And so when things go bad, when there's inflation or when the price of oil drops, there are no checks and balances to try to right the ship. To me, that's kind of a very telling story, since our country has been through such a stress test of its own in that way, of our institutions, and continues to be.
Well, just by chance, I traveled to Venezuela a couple of days after the election in 2016 when Trump was elected. And I got there and all of my friends were shocked that Trump had been elected. And they said to me, now it's your turn, because Trump is another Chavez. And what they meant by that is that Trump is a demagogue and a populist. And essentially populism doesn't have an ideology. Chavez called himself a socialist. He wasn't, he was really a populist. Trump, the same. I mean, Trump, was on the right, but a populist still. And so these people, they say to me, well, now it's your turn. And then they would say, but at least America has strong institutions. And I said, not really, because Trump's going to become president with both houses of Congress in his party. They're going to capture the judiciary just like Chavez did. They're going to change the election laws just like Chavez did. And so what you see with Chavez was elections without checks and balances. And you learn that democracy requires both of those things. So the Chavistas love to talk about how many elections they hold and how frequently they hold elections. But if the president ends up having, something close to unlimited power, then that's not democracy.
You talk a lot about the pageantry and stagecraft of the Chavez years. You have this great phrase, socialismo, as opposed to socialismo. And then you have a great set piece where Chavez decides he wants to take a ride on a new train, and the whole country has to bend over backwards to get this photo op to work, when in fact there is no train at all.
Well, that was something where that was a short train line in the barrio where Hilda lives. And, I knew that this train line existed. And then at some point in my reporting years ago, somebody told me this story about this sort of faked ride on the train line. And I thought it was fascinating. And then I just sort of kept that in my head. And then when I started working on the book, I tracked down the story and talked to lots of people who had participated. And essentially what happened there is that they were building this very short, what we would call a stubway. It's an elevated train. It had 3 stations. It essentially went nowhere from nowhere. But it was meant to be, it was pork. I mean, not unlike here, you get those projects here as well. It was just, something for the people of that area so that they would feel enthusiastic and beholden to the government. And so they're building this thing, and it was an election year. It was 2012. Chavez was running for re-election. And the thing isn't done, and it's nowhere near done. And the government goes to the contractor and he says, well, Chavez wants to ride the train. And they said, well, we can't. There's no way we don't have the train. There's no way for the train to move. It's just tracks and there's nothing there. And this is a cable train. So it's pulled by a big cable similar to the cable car in San Francisco. The motors weren't in place. They didn't even have electricity. The computerized train system wasn't there. And they said, well, Chavez wants to ride the train. He's going to ride the train. The government said that. And so they paid $1 million or more to this contractor to fake a train ride. They built the train, they put it on the tracks, and they basically just hooked up a little sort of makeshift winch to the train so that it would move along the tracks from one station to the next, appearing as though it was functioning. And it was all broadcast on television. And it's just sort of once you know what actually was going on behind the scenes, it's kind of a spectacular demonstration of the hollowness of those sorts of things and of that whole idea of how to do government.
And they need a second rope to pull the train back. That was the howler there. So we're getting at some of the bigger questions, just of if a country is this rich in oil, why is it in so much trouble? The other piece of this is incredible in currency problems and hyperinflation, where they try to stabilize the currency and it creates a whole black market that people benefit off of, to the point where you're an idiot if you don't take advantage of the black market. If somebody pays you a certain amount of money for something, you're silly not to try to exchange it for dollars and then make a profit, but without actually buying and doing what you were doing with that money. How quickly or how completely things seem to turn upside down in that sense is just an amazing thing to behold. I thought I'd ask you about a couple more people that get at other corners of the Venezuela story. There's Jose Vicente.
Oh, okay. Well, he was a human rights lawyer who I had known for years. When I was originally stationed in Caracas as a correspondent there, I had talked to him occasionally for the stories I was working on. And then when I went down in 2019 to work on a book, I called him up and sat down to talk to him. And we had a whole very long conversation about, what he thought about the government or the conditions of the country, rather. And I noticed a certain kind of trembling of the lip and a nervousness about him that hadn't been there before. And he told me that he had been kidnapped by the security forces. And so on another occasion, I sat down with him and we talked for hours about it. And he told me the whole story. And it's a chilling story where they kidnapped him. They took him, they put a hood over his head. They took him somewhere, he has no idea where, and held him for a couple of days and threatened to kill him and beat him up and questioned him. So I tell his story, or he tells his story. And I don't know, it's just I remember sitting there listening to him tell this story, and I just felt so tense, and I felt like I was all, holding my body tightly, and he was sitting there, all contorted, and it's just a very visceral experience. I mean, fortunately, they ultimately let him go, and he made the decision at that time not to continue in that line of taking more human rights cases, partly because he'd already done dozens and dozens of them, and he just felt he needed a break. But that there's plenty of that.
So these stark human rights violations, and then also a complete incompetence when it comes to the power grid. You would think that an energy-rich country, a resources-rich country, would at least be able to maintain their power grid, but this is something, the blackouts are a continuing theme in your book. And you talk about four qualified people who had been helping to run the grid, who all had been drummed out of leadership positions by cronies of the government, who had been installed to run the power company as sort of sort of gifts, as a sort of a cronyism. And so then when things get really bad, they are forced back into service. Suddenly they look around, they realize no one knows what they're doing, and they need to bring those people in. I thought I'd ask how you came to arrive at them as the way to tell the story of how energy works in Venezuela.
How I came to them. Well, I mean, through a friend, I got in touch with one of them and then was able to reach out to the others. These were four guys who had been friends for years, and they were managers and engineers at the electric utility. And like Bob said, for different reasons, they were driven out for internal political reasons by these incompetent people who were running the place. And then the power goes out across the country, and the electric company can't turn it back on. It's out for days. And so these guys get phone calls that said, we need your help. And at least one of them, well, they were all very reluctant to go back because they were afraid of being made scapegoats. Some of them were scapegoated out of the company originally. In other words, they were essentially, Maduro put a general in charge of the company because he needed to buy off the military or buy loyalty there. And the general was always accusing people of sabotage. And he accused one of these guys of sabotage, and they threatened to arrest him and send him to jail. And of course, there was nothing behind it. But so they were reluctant to go back, and they ultimately did. And they, they helped turn the power back on in the country. But each of them is a really interesting person in their own right. And also the interesting thing was that they were all Chavistas. They were all really dedicated to the idea of Chavismo, and especially to Chavez, who by then was dead. But it was fascinating for me to see these people who were so dedicated to this thing, and who had been so misused by the people who, at the top echelons of all this, and that they still had this tremendous loyalty to the idea. And I admire that in a way. I mean, I admire their faith. And I write in the book that I'm a newspaper reporter, and, we're taught to have faith in the truth and to be skeptical of just about everything. And so I see a value in these people who, they're truly decent people and worked hard and had faith in something. And despite everything, they stuck with it. So
there is this great chasm in the book between ideals and reality, and not just in Venezuela, in the United States, where both parties now, it benefits them both in terms of trying to get those Florida electoral votes to talk about the Maduro government in Venezuela as a socialist menace, as a domino that could fall and then turn all of Latin America socialist. The S word gets thrown a lot around a lot about Venezuela now, but that's its own ideal and symbol that we are kind of addicted to. I have a couple more questions that I thought I'd turn it to just our perception of Venezuela, but before I do, I'll just say, now is your chance to enter some questions into the Q&A portion of the Zoom. Please click and type in your questions, and Willie will be happy to answer them. So America, with its own problems with populism and with its fixation on Venezuela, this book is more relevant than perhaps you even could have anticipated, given what's happening geopolitically today. I mean, Venezuela is a place where we've been trying sanctions for quite some time, and sanctions are now back in the news. I wondered if you thought there were some takeaways from the Venezuela experience that might help us understand the challenge we have now with our new adventure in sanctions with Russia.
Well, I mean, there's a lot going on right now with Venezuela, and this whole sort of overture to Venezuela in the hopes of buying some Venezuelan oil, even though we've banned oil purchases from Venezuela. But in terms of the sanctions against Russia and the sanctions against Venezuela, I mean, sanctions are a difficult thing, and they're complicated. They don't generally work very well. I think that the type of sanctions on Russia are even, I mean, the sanctions on Venezuela are crippling, and yet Venezuela has been able to survive. And by Venezuela, I mean the government has remained in place. People have suffered quite a lot from the sanctions, and the sanctions in Venezuela are deeply unpopular. And that certainly is a question that you would have to have about Russia ultimately is, as Russians suffer from the Western sanctions, will they blame Putin or will they blame the West? So, they've had a tremendous impact in Venezuela in terms of the quality of people's lives, partly because they've made it much harder for Venezuela to sell its oil. And also impossible to get international financing, cut off from the international financial system, that sort of thing. But at the same time, Venezuela has managed, or the government has managed to continue selling its oil, and they go through all sorts of workarounds. The Iranians send what are called ghost tankers that are registered under a fake name and number, and they load up with oil, and then they sail off to across the ocean, and then somewhere off the coast of Malaysia, they offload from one tanker to another, and then the cargo gets renamed as Malaysian oil, and then it goes to these little refineries in China. So, the same thing is true of Iran, and it was the Iranians who taught the Venezuelans how to do this and have helped them do it. In the case of Venezuela, all the payments for the oil all go through Russian banks. And so Venezuela is in a difficult position now because their Russian bankers are cut off. And also because Russia now is going to have to sell its oil to the same Chinese refineries that have been buying Venezuelan oil. And Russia's closer. I guess one lesson is that sanctions don't work particularly well. They're complicated. They take quite a while to have an effect, or they can. People don't like them when they suffer because of them, and they can. In a way, the sanctions have benefited Maduro politically, because Maduro, from the very start, he made lots of mistakes and mismanaged the economy, and he kept blaming the gringos and saying, "Oh, there's an American economic war against Venezuela," which wasn't true until Trump made it true by putting all these general sanctions on Venezuela.
And then that war steps up when John Bolton and others decide, why not try to just depose Maduro? Why not just support his opponent, who is not, ostensibly a Democratic opposition member, but who is a deeply problematic figure in his own right, Guaido. You write with amazing detail and analysis about how the 16 things that went sideways during the Trump years, when the U.S. backs the opposition falls apart, and then something completely bonkers happens where you nail it down perfectly, where it seems that Guaido is actually trying to overthrow Maduro non-democratically. And so we're through the looking glass now, where the United States is propping up one would-be dictator over another. It's just, it feels like something out of fiction.
Well, I don't know that Guaido's idea was to become a dictator, but the gambit there was always there was never a plan with Guaido. That's the problem with him, is that the idea was like, oh, well, we'll declare ourselves president and something will happen. And the something that they wanted to happen was that either the US would invade and get rid of Maduro for them, or this would all prompt a coup, internal coup, to get rid of Maduro for them. But there was never any real strategy or planning that would make any of those things likely. So I think that what Bob was talking about here is this bizarre incident where, there's this sort of mini invasion of Venezuela. 2 small boats arrive, and in one of them, there's a couple of American Green Berets who were there as mercenaries. And this is all this sort of cockamamie scheme that was cooked up in Florida, and Guaido signed off on it, and even signed an extremely detailed, complex contract. And at one point I say, there were a lot of problems with this idea of this very untested young politician becoming so-called interim president. And one of them was his lack of experience. And so one of the problems with doing that is that it's the kind of person who might sign a contract with an unknown, with somebody to invade their own country. So it just is one thing on top of another.
The subtlety with which you write about Guaidó and about Maduro is really commendable. I mean, they come across as actual human beings and not as comic book characters. You even in talking about Guaidó now, you talk about there's something misbegotten about him, something untried and something young. He does exactly the wrong thing, and also is kind of has empty, doesn't have a lot of follow through. He's kind of his big issue isn't that he's a good guy or a bad guy, it's that he's disorganized and or perhaps not up to the job. And Maduro is even more complex. I mean, you could have very easily written about him as a cardboard pale imitation of Chavez, or as an autocrat who pretending to be a socialist, but you actually get at a weird mystical fatalistic side of him. I thought I'd ask you a little about that too.
Also, I think that it's when Maduro comes in as president, a lot of people made fun of him and said that he wasn't up to the task. And he had been for a very brief time a bus driver when he was younger. And so, they said he's just a stupid bus driver. And I always thought that was a terrible mistake and a misrepresentation. And I still think so, because he's not stupid. He's obviously very skilled politically. And when he first came in, lots of people, including in his own party, didn't think that he would be around for very long. And the thing that he was very good at is sort of palace politics and keeping himself in power and playing off the different factions of Chavismo and the different factions of the opposition. That none of those things make him a good person or a statesman, but it demonstrates that he's not stupid. So no, he is a complex personality, and he does. I mean, I was talking with one of his close aides, somebody who had been very close to him for a long time, and I was trying to understand what goes on with Maduro and why he never seemed capable of making a decision, because this was during a period in time when the economy was getting worse and worse, and there were all sorts of things that he could do, and he just wouldn't make a decision. And the guy said, well, he believes in fate. He believes that if something is going to happen, it will happen. And okay. Believe that there was some sort of divine hand, divine providence that would guide him and the country.
It's actually good for his morale, because he thinks, as you write, that he never really thinks that he's going to die, because if on any particular day, because he thinks, well, there would be a sign. I would have gotten a sign if I had died. I'm ready to get into some of our Q&A questions, but I see Oliver from Greenlight has appeared back on there. Is there something up that you wanted to announce?
I just wanted to say we're getting close to the end, so I wanted to make sure we got to those questions in the Q&A.
We have a question that came in very early about climate and about the ecology. Venezuela is supposed to use methods that severely degrade the environment. So what justification is there to work with them? This is the question. I assume they're talking, this is about oil. And
I'm not quite sure what methods they're talking about. I mean, there have been quite a few, there have been several oil spills lately on the coast. There's one or two oil spills on the coast, and then as in my travels around the country, I would get to these oil facilities, and there's just like oil pooling everywhere, and a lot of that is just because of the lack of investment and maintenance. So I suppose you could make an argument that it's the sanctions and the mismanagement have made those issues worse. And that it's pretty urgent that there be some kind of investment in the oil company to keep oil spills from happening and to clean up what's happened already. I don't know. I mean, one of the other things that I write about and that I reported on when I was there in 2019 is the gold mining. There's this large section of the country in the southeast of the country where there's all this gold mining in the jungle, and that's just horrible. I mean, the pollution of the rivers because of the mining, the stripping out of the forests, the violence and the violation of the rights of the indigenous communities is really intense there, and just shocking. So yeah, that's another thing.
Yeah, in the book you get into detail about how poorly maintained some of these vital bits of infrastructure are, not in a way that even we see with our crumbling infrastructure, but with the whole grid collapsing just because routine maintenance is ignored, not because of some huge structural problem or because of terrorism or any other big reason, but small reasons bringing everything down. Which brings
I used to cover the subways in New York, and I remember talking to the guy who created the maintenance plan for the subway system, because it's kind of like the subway system in the 70s and early 80s when there were track fires all the time and derailments and everything. And this guy came along inside the MTA and said, well, we ought to do more maintenance. And that's literally the kind of thing that doesn't happen. It's like a whole country and a whole industry, multiple industries where they just aren't planning, and they also don't have the money to even buy spare parts. And so they fall apart and everything goes off the rails.
This is a great segue to one more question. And it's another big picture question, like along the lines of how does a country with so much oil get into so much trouble? This question is the story of the collapse of Venezuela's economic system largely the product of self-inflicted wounds, or were there external forces involved? And this, you can talk a little bit about sanctions, but really just more cosmically and holistically, is there something geopolitically happening that really rigged the game for them, or is it self-inflicted?
No, that's a great question. The answer is both, because, I mean, Venezuela created its own problems. The economy tanked, for a variety of reasons. One, the country never was able to sort of get off the monoculture oil track. And so everything was always dependent on the oil industry, and oil always has these boom and bust cycles, and they never prepared for the bust during the boom. Once the bust came, the government made lots of terrible decisions, mismanaged the currency, spent all sorts of deficit spending that fed inflation, price controls that screwed up the production and distribution of things. So there's a lot of self-inflicted wounds. At the same time, once the US steps in and does these generalized sanctions, cutting it off financially, barring oil sales, et cetera, that deepens the damage. And then, of course, in terms of the big picture, it's the price of oil. I mean, when Venezuela has gone through these booms at different periods when the price of oil is high, and then they don't prepare, and the price bottoms out. I mean, it happened in the 70s in the first big oil boom, and happened in a lot of countries then where you had that cycle. The thing about Venezuela is that they didn't learn from that experience and change what they did the second time around. Some countries did, but Venezuela did not.
The human side of this, which you'll all read when you read this book, is watching people reacclimate themselves to new standards after years of getting handouts and really of being supported by government oil, suddenly living in a world where the power's off for 3 days at a time, every 3 days, is something that you see people reorganizing their lives around. And it's really stunning to see. And for a window into human nature in all its forms, you could really do well to look at Willie's book. Congratulations again. And I hope everybody buys a copy and gets one with Willie's signature. And I'll let Oliver Greenlight close us out.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you guys so much for that conversation. That was really great to listen to. That was very engaging. Sorry about the noise on my end. I have birds. They yell if I don't play them some music. So that's what you guys were hearing. Very sorry about that. But yeah, thank you again so much for tonight. Thank you so much for that fantastic reading and discussion. And thanks to you all for joining us. Don't forget to buy your copy if things are never so bad that they can't get worse, in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Don't forget to use that Greenlight Events 10 for that 10% discount, and put in the comments section that you'd like a signed copy, because Mr. Neuman will be signing them tomorrow morning, I believe, in store. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone. And I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you guys again.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much.